Hey, 42 here. Robert Fleming Jr. was standing watch on the deck of a warship one evening when he saw a strange object in the water off the starboard bow. At first, he thought it was a log, but then he noticed a glint of what looked like metal. That was enough to raise his suspicions that turned to outright alarm when the weird metallic log started heading right for his ship. Fleming raised the alarm and everyone nearby carrying a gun opened fire on the approaching vessel. It was too late. An explosion shook the ship and 5 minutes later, it was gone. Sunk, as you may have already guessed, by a torpedo from a submarine. But this wasn't just any submarine, and the scene I just described wasn't just any old naval engagement. It was the first time in history that a submarine successfully sank an enemy ship in battle. But here's an odd question for you. When do you think it happened? If you guessed the First World War, then I don't blame you. It was during the First World War that submarines were first widely used. But the very first successful sub-attack took place a full half a century before Archduke Franz Ferdinand met his maker by way of an assassin's bullet. Robert Fleming Jr. didn't serve in the Great War. He was a sailor in the Union Navy during the American Civil War, and the ship he was serving on, the USS Housatonic, was sunk by a submarine called the H.L. Hunley 160 years ago, in 1864. The sinking of the USS Housatonic was a monumental moment in the history of warfare, but for the crew of the Hunley, the celebrations were short-lived. Shortly after the attack, eyewitnesses from both sides reported seeing a bright blue light on the water, a signal to shore from the Hunley's crew confirming that their mission was successful. It was the last trace anyone would ever see of them for more than a century. Because the history-making submarine never made it back to shore that night, and neither did its 8-man crew. In the decades after its demise, dozens of expeditions tried and failed to find the lost sub, and the fate of H.L. Hunley became one of the biggest mysteries of the entire Civil War. But in 1995, the wreck was found. 5 years later, it was painstakingly raised from its resting place on the ocean floor as the world held its breath. After more than a century of waiting, we were finally going to learn the fate of the first submarine ever to sink an enemy ship in battle. Or at least, that's what we thought. But then, things got weird. Displate is a platform for artists with thousands of creators from all across the globe sharing their unique designs, paintings, and illustrations on metal canvas. There are over 2 million artworks available in the Displate catalogue. Discover new original art or choose from officially licensed designs from the likes of Star Wars, Marvel, Elden Ring, and many other iconic brands and franchises. Displate has just launched a new product line called Displate Textra. They have tactile 3D textures, and they're now available across a vast selection of pop culture metal posters. I've just hung some Displates in my home and they look incredible. The print quality is the best I've ever seen and they just pop right off the metal canvas. It's tool-free, safe for your walls, and super quick. Each Displate comes with a magnet kit, so everything you need is right in the box. I could not believe how easy and quick it was to displate my Displates. Oh, and you can swap them out anytime in less than 10 seconds. I'm super happy with how my Displates look, and now you can get them delivered in 4 to 5 business days. And Displate is celebrating Black Friday. Now they are offering the biggest discounts of the whole year with up to 44% off your order. Also, for the first time ever, Textra designs will be discounted too. Use my link in the description. The discount code is applied automatically, or just use my code 42 to get the biggest discount of the year right now. Make sure to act fast because it's not forever. And a special thanks to Displate for sponsoring this video. Before the wreck was recovered, the working theory was that the sub had sunk and the crew had drowned. But when archaeologists began studying the wreckage, what they found didn't seem to make any sense. When ships and submarines sink with their crews inside, a certain grisly pattern almost always emerges in the wreckage. The human remains are found clustered around the exit points. It makes sense. If you're trapped inside a sinking ship, there's only one place you're going to go. But the human remains inside the H.L. Hunley were arranged according to a very different pattern. The bones were found in neat little piles along the sub's interior. And that meant that every single member of the crew died at their station. Drowning men don't just sit calmly at their posts and wait to die. They fight for their lives with every ounce of strength they possess. But if the crew of the H.L. Hunley didn't drown that night, what the hell happened to them? Like most civil wars, the American Civil War was largely fought on land. Largely, but not entirely. Early on, President Abraham Lincoln, leader of the Union forces, realized that whoever held the Atlantic coast would control key trade and resupply routes to the east. In 1861, Lincoln implemented a vast naval blockade against the southern states. It was extremely effective, and the Confederates were soon looking for ways to break through. The question was how. There was no hope of beating Lincoln's fleet head-on. The Union not only had more ships, they had more shipyards to build new ones. If the Confederates wanted to break Lincoln's blockade, they were going to need to get creative. They say that desperation is the mother of all invention, and in 1863, Old Mother Desperation gave birth to the attack sub. Ouch. Before it became part of military history, the name H.L. Hunley belonged not to a submarine, but to a man who was instrumental in developing it, Horace Lawson Hunley. The submarine that inherited his name after his untimely death, more on that in a minute, was incredibly basic by modern standards. In earlier designs, Hunley and his partners toyed with the idea of powering the submarine with a small steam engine. But given the time and technology constraints, in the end they settled for a significantly less high-tech source of propulsion: manpower. The Hunley was designed for a crew of 8 men, 1 to fill the role of captain, and 7 to power the hand crank that turned the propeller. With 7 men simultaneously cranking one out, the sub had a sprightly top speed of about 4 knots, the equivalent of a brisk walking pace for us landlubbers. Conditions for the men inside were brutal. You can see from this picture just how small the internal space was. The men couldn't even sit fully upright as they worked to crank. Just like the sub itself, the torpedo was very basic. To be honest, it was pretty much just a bomb on a stick. There was no propulsion system, so the only way to actually use it was to get in close and stick it to the hull of the target ship. Despite its simplicity, early tests were promising. In July 1863, the Hunley successfully sank an old coal barge anchored in Mobile Bay in front of a certain Admiral Franklin Buchanan, the only full admiral in the entire Confederate fleet. He was so impressed, he sent the sub to the key port city of Charleston by rail with a plan to use it against the Union blockade. Unfortunately, this early success was not to be replicated in Charleston, at least not at first. Not long after arriving, the Hunley sank whilst moored in the harbour. Some reports claim it was swamped by the wake of a passing boat, others that the captain accidentally trod on a lever that controlled the diving planes, submerging the sub with the hatches still open. The tiny interior and narrow hatches of the Hunley made it incredibly difficult to escape from, so what probably at first seemed like a minor incident soon turned deadly. 3 of the crew were able to swim to safety, but the remaining 5 were trapped inside as the Hunley was carried to the harbour floor. The experimental sub was recovered and patched up, but it wasn't long before disaster struck yet again. Less than 2 months after that first fatal accident, Horace Hunley himself was on board during a test of the sub's diving capabilities. The sub successfully submerged beneath the harbour waves, but something went wrong during the dive and all 8 men on board, including Horace Hunley, were drowned. You'd have forgiven the Confederates for binning the entire project right there and then. The H.L. Hunley had certainly proved itself to be deadly, just not to the enemy. But despite the mishaps, the Hunley was a genuinely revolutionary machine with the potential to swing the war in the Confederacy's favour. And so, the submarine was once again hauled up from the harbour floor and refitted, ready to launch against a Union blockade. The rest is history. Under cover of darkness on the 17th of February 1864, the H.L. Hunley succeeded in sinking the USS Housatonic, one of the mightiest ships in the Union fleet. All we need to do now is figure out what happened next. Let's start with the evidence. When the Hunley was salvaged in the year 2000, it was in one piece and the hatches were closed. But two large holes were found in the hull. The Hunley was equipped with both a ballast tank and removable keel weights, both of which could have been used to surface quickly in an emergency, but neither of these safety mechanisms were triggered by the crew. The remains of the 8 men on board were found in neat piles with very little mixing of the bones, indicating that they died at their respective stations within the sub. The bones also showed no signs of any damage, for example from an explosion. Finally, the wreck of the Hunley was found 275 meters further out to sea than the wreck of the USS Housatonic. For some reason, it had travelled in exactly the wrong direction after the attack. Okay, that's the evidence. But what does it all mean? Let's start by ruling out what is probably the first thing to spring to mind when a sub is lost at sea. Implosion. There's no chance whatsoever that the Hunley imploded because the wreck was found just 9 meters beneath the surface, nowhere near crush depth. The most striking feature of the recovered wreck were the 2 big holes in the hull. One theory was that the Hunley was accidentally rammed by the USS Canandaigua, which arrived on the scene not long after the attack to look for the Union survivors. A catastrophic failure of the hull would explain why the crew didn't try to surface. They wouldn't have had the time. But it isn't a great fit for the rest of the evidence. The Canandaigua was a very big ship. If it had crashed into the Hunley, the damage would likely have been a lot worse than just 2 holes. There's also the small matter of the positioning of the crew in the wreck. They might not have had time to release the keel weights or engage the ballast pump, but they would have had time to try and swim out of the hatches. They might not have made it, but if they tried, their remains would have been found clustered around the hatches with significantly more mixing of the bones. The theory was dismissed for good in the early 2000s when scientists analysing sediment deposits inside the wreckage determined that the holes in the hull didn't appear until long after the sinking. They weren't the telltale signs of a catastrophic accident. They were scars earned in a different kind of battle, one fought over many decades against the dual effects of erosion and corrosion on the ocean floor. We can also rule out the most popular theory of the Civil War era, that a lucky shot fired from the deck of the USS Housatonic either hit the Hunley's captain, a man called George Dixon, or pierced the hull and caused a leak. In a 2017 study, scientists investigating the mystery showed that Civil War-era rifles were powerful enough to puncture the sub's hull. But even if there was a so-called lucky shot, the crew would have recognised the danger and reacted. The positioning of the bones in the wreckage and the lack of use of the ballast pump and keel weights proves that didn't happen. The same can be said for many of the theories about the sinking. The fact that the crew didn't seem to have reacted to their impending death is extremely weird and hard to explain. It's almost as though they didn't know they were in danger. So then, any ideas? In modern submarines, fresh oxygen is typically supplied either by pressurized tanks or generated on board through the electrolysis of water, which uses electricity to split H2O into its constituent parts, hydrogen and oxygen. This second method is especially handy because it means you can get more oxygen whenever you need it directly from the seawater your sub is floating in. But of course, the Hunley was very far from being a modern submarine. Its oxygen was provided by way of a couple of snorkel tubes attached to a set of bellows. At best, it likely wasn't a very effective system, and according to one former crewman, it didn't really function at all. Even if the Hunley's snorkels actually worked, they could only supply fresh air near the surface. During a deeper dive, the sub became a closed system with a limited supply of oxygen. So what if that supply simply ran out? Death by asphyxiation would explain how the crew died despite a lack of obvious damage to the sub. More importantly, it might also explain the most mysterious aspect of the whole case, why the crew appeared to have died without ever moving from their stations. It's a weird quirk of human physiology that our bodies aren't very good at detecting and responding to low levels of oxygen in our tissues, a condition known as hypoxia. If someone removed all the oxygen from the room you're sitting in right now and replaced it with, say, nitrogen, you'd quickly asphyxiate without ever realizing that something was wrong. What if something similar happened to the crew? If oxygen levels in the sub dropped fast enough, theoretically they might have died without recognizing that they were in danger. And if they didn't know they were in danger, they would have had no reason to leave their stations or attempt to surface. It all fits, but before we get carried away, there's a complication. Whilst it's true that the human body is relatively poor at detecting low levels of oxygen, it's extremely good at detecting high levels of CO2, a condition called hypercapnia. If CO2 levels in the sub climbed high enough, the crew would have experienced headaches, confusion, sleepiness, and a shortness of breath. Crucially, they would have known immediately what these symptoms meant. They'd completed several long test dives for exactly that purpose. If any of the crew had shown signs of hypercapnia the night the Hunley was lost, they would have surfaced immediately. Better to take your chances with the enemy than face certain death by asphyxiation. So what does all this mean for the theory? Well, to put it simply, death by asphyxiation is only a valid explanation for the loss of the Hunley if the crew experienced hypoxia, which they might not have noticed before they experienced hypercapnia, which they definitely would have. So which way around was it? In 2016, a team of scientists decided to find out. They used the dimensions of the wreck to determine the volume of air the Hunley would have held. Then modelled how quickly both hypoxia and hypercapnia would have set in using a range of different respiratory rates for the crew. In every single simulation the team ran, they got the same basic result. Hypercapnia always kicked in long before hypoxia. If the crew asphyxiated that night, they would have known it was happening well in advance. It isn't definitive, but it's a very strong indication that death by asphyxiation is not our answer here. As soon as those hypercapnia symptoms kicked in, they would have headed straight for the surface. Since the ballast pump wasn't used and the keel weights were untouched, we know that they didn't. So, the sub wasn't damaged, it wasn't a lucky shot, and the crew probably didn't asphyxiate. What else even is there? If you're starting to run out of ideas, you aren't alone. For several years, nobody really had a convincing answer to this question. But a new discovery in 2013 changed everything. When the Hunley was first found, the spar that once held the torpedo was still attached. With archaeologists initially focused on the sub itself, the spar wasn't investigated in much detail until 2013, at which point they realised it had been hiding a potentially game-changing piece of the HL Hunley's puzzle. According to the original design, the sub spar torpedo was triggered remotely by way of a rope. The sub would ram the torpedo into the side of the target ship, leaving the payload behind. Then it would reverse to a distance of about 30 meters, at which point a rope attached to the payload would trigger the explosion. But when a thick layer of concretion was removed from the spar in 2013, we found something completely unexpected. Part of the copper casing that made up the torpedo's payload. What little metal remained had been folded backwards like paper. But what was it doing there? The entire payload was supposed to be left stuck to the side of the Housatonic before it exploded. If part of it was still attached to the spar, which itself was still attached to the sub, it could only mean one thing. The HL Hunley was still attached to its torpedo when it exploded. After a bit more detective work, archaeologists realised that the entire trigger mechanism for the torpedo had been changed at the very last minute. This version wasn't triggered at range by a rope, it was pressure sensitive. When the Hunley rammed the USS Housatonic 160 years ago, its torpedo exploded immediately on impact, which means the sub and its crew weren't chilling 30 meters away like we thought. They were separated from the explosion by the length of the spar, just 5 meters. At first, it might not be obvious why that's such a big deal. We already know the Hunley's hull wasn't significantly damaged before it sank. Those 2 holes appeared much later on, and we know that the crew's bones were undamaged. But just because the hull and the crew survived the explosion in one piece, that doesn't mean they didn't suffer catastrophic damage. When explosives detonate, they generate a high pressure wave that expands outwards from the center of the explosion. This wave is made up of molecules, usually air, but in this case water, that have been smushed together. It can be incredibly destructive. Now that we know the Hunley was so close to the explosion that sank the Housatonic, is it possible that the crew died in the resulting blast wave? In a word, yes. The wave would have passed right through the hull of the sub, right through the air inside, and right through the crew. The effects of high-pressure blast waves on the human body are not pleasant. Being full of air, our lungs are particularly badly affected. A powerful blast wave can essentially tear them to pieces, leaving the victim coughing up blood and unable to breathe. Blast waves can also damage the brain, travelling right through the skull and causing hemorrhaging. These kinds of injuries are often fatal. If the crew of the Hunley were hit by a powerful blast wave, it could have killed them instantly, or left them incapacitated and unable to respond to the various dangers of their situation. A 2017 study attempted to test the blast wave theory using a scale model of the Hunley and a proportionately miniaturized black powder torpedo. Based on the results of those tests, the paper concluded that each member of the crew would have had a 95% chance of suffering severe pulmonary trauma and an 84% chance of death. No reconstruction is ever perfect, so the results aren't completely conclusive, but the evidence is extremely compelling. The blast wave theory explains why the crew never left their stations and why they didn't try to save themselves. It also explains why the sub was found on the wrong side of the Housatonic. If the crew died almost immediately, the Hunley would have simply drifted out on the outgoing tide before bottoming out. So, there you have it. This 160-year-old mystery has finally been solved. The crew of the HL Hunley were either killed or incapacitated by a blast wave from the explosion of the very torpedo that put them in the history books. Or were they? It's true that the blast wave theory is very convincing, but there is one piece of evidence in this infuriating puzzle that still doesn't fit. I've already mentioned it in this video. Did you spot it? Let's rewind. Shortly after the sinking of Housatonic, eyewitnesses from both sides reported seeing a bright blue light on the water, a signal to shore from the Hunley's crew confirming that their mission was successful. It was the last trace anyone would ever see of them for more than a century. The blue light in question was essentially a primitive kind of flare, and it had to be triggered by hand. But if the crew were incapacitated or killed by the explosion that destroyed the Housatonic, who set off the flare? The answer is, of course, that we have no idea. Supporters of the blast theory typically dismiss the sightings of the blue light as being down to unreliable eyewitness accounts. That's certainly possible. Eyewitnesses are rubbish. But it is a hell of a coincidence that sailors on both sides independently reported having seen the exact same signal. Maybe one or more of the crew of the Hunley was still in good enough shape after the blast to light the flare. Maybe someone else set off the pyrotechnics for a completely different reason. Or maybe the blast wave theory is simply incorrect, and we're still missing some key evidence needed to unlock this mystery. For now, we simply have no way of knowing. And unless the wreck of the HL Hunley has a few more secrets to give up, we likely never will. At least, not for sure. Personally, I hope the blast wave theory is correct. Of all the ways those 8 men may have died that night, near instant death by blast wave would probably have resulted in the least suffering. But before I leave you on this one, I have one more story to tell you about this incredible Civil War sub. It isn't directly related to the mystery, but it's too cool not to share. Long before the wreck of the Hunley was rediscovered, descendants of the sub's final captain, George Dixon, passed down a kind of family legend through the generations. According to the story, Dixon always carried a lucky gold coin with him. Lucky because it had literally saved his life during the Battle of Shiloh by partially deflecting a Union bullet destined to land in his thigh. It sounds exactly like one of those silly wartime stories that probably never happened. I mean, seriously, how many times have you seen the whole random object stopping a bullet trope in books and films? But in this case, it turned out to be true, because hidden amongst the pile of bones that belonged to Captain George Dixon was a single $20 coin made of solid gold. The coin was engraved on one side with a message: Shiloh, April 6, 1862. My life preserver, G.E.D. It was bent right down the middle, as though it had been struck with a bullet, which of course it had. In April 2004, a full 140 years after their deaths, the crew of the Hunley were laid to rest in Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston. All 8 men were buried with full Confederate honors, and tens of thousands of people attended the funeral, the last of the American Civil War. We may not know for sure what happens to the incredibly brave men who rowed the H.L. Hunley to death and glory in 1864, but hopefully now they finally rest in peace. Thanks for watching. Just a quick word to say that I couldn't make these videos without the support of my Patreon members. Consider joining the exclusive 42 Discord community by supporting me on Patreon. It's a great place to discuss my videos with like-minded individuals and myself. The link's in the description, but if you don't want to, or you can't join my Patreon, then please don't worry. A simple like or comment to say thanks would also put a huge smile on my face. Thank you.